The sun was beating down mercilessly, turning the city street into a boiling artery full of people, cars, and bustle. The laughter of children merged with the noise of car horns, creating a familiar urban backdrop. But suddenly, this harmony was broken. A loud, angry voice cut through the noise, causing passers-by to freeze. "Hey, you! Stop!" It sounded sharp, like a gunshot. The crowd parted as if by an invisible hand, revealing a scene that made hearts clench. A large man in a police uniform stood in the center of the sidewalk, his face twisted with anger. Across from him, a boy of about 10 years old sat in a wheelchair. His face was frozen with fear. His fingers clutched tightly to the armrests, as if the chair were the last stronghold of his safety. "Can't you hear me?" the policeman shouted, taking a sharp step forward. "Show me your papers." The boy, not knowing what to say, lowered his gaze. His lips trembled, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't get the words out. The crowd stared, frozen, a few of them glancing around, hesitant to intervene. "Yeah, I was just waiting for Daddy," the boy whispered in a low whisper. "Your dad?" The policeman grinned, his tone mocking. "Of course he'll show up and tell me a story. In the meantime, give it to me." He grabbed the handles of the wheelchair with brutal determination. "Please, don't touch." The boy squeezed his fingers even tighter, but that only made the man angrier. "What do you mean, don't touch? You're trespassing. I said stand up and show me your papers." The policeman pushed the chair sharply, and the boy lost his balance and almost fell down. Someone in the crowd gasped. A middle-aged woman took a step forward, but stopped immediately, catching the cold stare of the policeman. There was a tension in the air, as if time had slowed down. "You see, he's a child." At last, a voice came from the crowd, but it was immediately drowned out by the policeman's loud reply. "None of your business. This one." He hesitated for a moment, then mockingly said, "The citizen is obviously hiding something." The boy sat silent, his eyes glistening with tears. The policeman, as if enjoying his power, finally wrenched the chair out from under his weak arms and rolled it aside. The crowd froze in horror, and it seemed that in a moment it would turn into total chaos. But then, from deep within the crowd, someone spoke loudly and confidently. "Take your hands off my son." The voice sounded low and cold, like thunder before the storm. The policeman turned, and the crowd opened up, revealing a man who was already striding toward the center of the conflict. His face was tense, but the calmness in his movements and his gaze said one thing: this man had not come to lose. The policeman glanced at the man who stepped out of the crowd. His confident look and firm voice clearly embarrassed the lawman, but only for a moment. Then, as if protecting his wounded authority, he turned back to the boy, ignoring the approaching parent. "Oh, that's your daddy?" He smirked, barely containing his venomous sneer. "Well, I can see why you're so bold. You think you can do anything here, don't you? You think the law doesn't apply to you? You've got too many privileges." Privileges. He spat out the last words with contempt, as if it were not a human being, but something dirty and unnecessary. The boy looked at the policeman with wide-open eyes, as if trying to understand what he had done to cause such hatred. The policeman grabbed the handles of the wheelchair again and yanked with force. The boy tried to hold on, but his weak arms could not resist the adult man's roughness. The wheels of the chair screeched across the asphalt, leaving black streaks until the policeman stopped. "You don't even deserve to sit in that chair," he threw over his shoulder, addressing the crowd more than the boy. "All they know how to do is whine about equality. but what they really want is to be pitied all the time. Do you really think you got that chair fair and square? No, I'll see how you do without it. He jerked the chair into the air, leaving the boy on the pavement. He tumbled helplessly to his side and tried to lift himself up on his arms, but he fell back down. His thin arms buckled under the weight of his own body, and abrasions quickly appeared on his palms. The boy's eyes filled with tears of humiliation and pain, but he still said nothing. Only the trembling in his body betrayed the fear he was trying to hide. The crowd watched in silence. No one moved from their seats. Some turned away, as if hoping that if they couldn't see it, it wasn't happening. Others, on the other hand, eagerly absorbed it like a spectacle, and didn't even try to hide their curiosity. "Look at him," the policeman shouted, pointing at the boy. "There he is, an example of your pathetic attempts to appear equal. You can't even stand up without help, and yet you're still demanding rights." He tossed the chair to the ground like a piece of trash. It bounced off the pavement, hitting the curb, and fell on its side with a loud thud. The sound echoed through the street like a gunshot, causing many people to flinch. But no one moved. No one came forward to help the boy. The policeman turned to the crowd and joined their silent reaction. His face expressed gloating and smugness. "What? Nobody wants to help?" he asked mockingly, giving the passers-by a scornful look. "Afraid? That's right. I'm the law, and I'll tell you who's right and who's wrong. And this one?" He nodded at the boy still lying on the pavement. "Let him lie there. Maybe it will teach him to respect order." At that moment, his father approached the boy. He slowly knelt down beside his son, ignoring the policeman. The boy, still trembling, looked up at his father with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "It's okay," the man said quietly, putting his hand on his son's shoulder. His voice was full of restrained strength. "I'm here now." The policeman hummed, glancing at the man. "What about you? You want to play the hero? You think you have the balls to save yourself? Your rights don't mean anything here." The father rose slowly, his figure towering over the boy and the policeman himself. A cold fire burned in his eyes. "You have no idea what you've just done," he said in an even, almost threatening voice. "But you will soon." There was a tense silence, and a sense of impending storm hung in the air. The boy lay on the cold asphalt, trying not to look into the eyes of the policeman, who hovered over him like a predator over its prey. The crack of the fallen chair was still ringing in his ears, mingling with the noise of the crowd. His thin arms tried to find support to lift himself up, but every movement brought sharp pain. "What? You can't get up?" The policeman grinned venomously, leaning toward him. "Maybe you're not even disabled. You're just pretending to get sympathy from people. You people like you do it all the time." The words hit harder than the physical pain. The boy raised his head, his lips quivering as if he wanted to say something, but the policeman interrupted him before any sound could be made. "Shut up," he said sharply. "I don't need your pathetic excuses. You think pretending to be unhappy will make me apologize to you. Ha! People like you don't belong here. I'd like to see all your—" He stopped, glaring at the boy's father, but his face made it clear what he wanted to say. The boy, holding back tears, finally said quietly, "Please, give me my chair back. I can't." The policeman straightened up sharply when he heard his weak voice and laughed loudly. The laugh was loud, harsh, and full of contempt. The crowd began to shuffle from foot to foot, but no one dared to say a word. "You can't?" the policeman mocked, mimicking a pitying tone. "Maybe you can't sit here until Daddy files a complaint? How many times have I seen people like you?" complaining about life, demanding privileges, but you can't do anything about it. The policeman's words seemed to inflame the crowd. Some of them stood there with embarrassed looks, while others, more violent, laughed with him. No one even thought of approaching the boy or helping him. It was as if he had ceased to be a human being, becoming a target for ridicule and humiliation. The boy tried to rise again, but his arms buckled and he fell to the pavement again. A drop of blood appeared on his elbow, but he didn't even seem to notice it. His eyes glistened with tears, but he tried hard not to cry, knowing it would only increase the ridicule. "Come on, get up," the policeman shouted, beginning to lose his patience. "Prove you're worth something. Or are you really that useless? Do you want me to lift you up? Or should I carry you in my arms? Oh yes, you're used to having someone carry you all the time." He stepped toward the boy, grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, and yanked him upward. The boy's body, light and weak, rose a few centimeters above the pavement like a rag doll. His neck snapped, and he cried out in pain. "Enough!" A voice came from the crowd, but it was immediately silenced when the policeman cast his angry glare there. "Who else wants to teach me how to work?" he shouted, letting go of the boy, who collapsed to the pavement again. "Look at him. Let him know his place." The policeman was about to continue, but at that moment the boy's father stepped closer. His face was like stone, and the voice he uttered sounded flat and cold. "You made your choice. Now I'm going to make mine." The policeman grinned, but a shadow of doubt flashed in his eyes for a moment. He was not used to such calm. The boy's father no longer looked like a man who could be easily intimidated or silenced. This was the beginning of the end. The crowd in the street was growing, as if people were drawn here by the magnetism of the injustice at hand. Some stood silent, hesitant to intervene. Others whispered, glancing at the boy or the policeman. Tension was rising, as if the heat of the city was adding to the oppressive atmosphere. "It's awful, but what can we do?" mumbled an elderly woman standing outside the store. She was clutching her bag to her chest, her eyes full of pity, but her feet felt as if they were stuck to the ground. "He's a policeman." "Policeman or not, that's not the point," the man beside me replied quietly, his face frowning with anger. "But I don't want to get in trouble. We all know how this is going to end." These words, spoken in a whisper, echoed among the crowd like an invisible signal. People turned away, as if hoping that ignoring what was happening would absolve them of responsibility. No one dared even approach the boy, who was still lying on the pavement, clutching his bloody hands. "See?" the policeman said loudly, casting a scornful glance at the crowd. "No one will lift a finger to help you. Everybody knows I'm right. They know who the law is." His voice was so loud that some passers-by flinched, but no one said a word. A few people glanced over, disapproving of what was happening, but only in whispers. "It's a child," exhaled a young girl standing a little farther away. "Why doesn't anyone do anything?" "Because it's dangerous," her companion replied sharply, pulling her in by the arm. "Do you want him to switch to you? Just leave it alone." But it was clear that not everyone was comfortable keeping quiet. Some were already pulling out their phones, filming what was happening. There was a quiet clicking of cameras and a tense energy in the air, as if someone was about to explode. The policeman noticed him being filmed and his face contorted with anger. He stepped toward one of the young men with a phone in his hand and spat it out. "What? You think you can film me? This is illegal. Put the camera away or I'll arrest you right now." The young man quickly put the phone down, his hands shaking, but the teenager standing next to him with a cap on his head did not move. "You're breaking the law," he said, looking straight at the policeman. "We have the right to film in the street. It will be seen." The crowd gasped. Some even stepped back, as if the statement might provoke the policeman to even more drastic action. The policeman turned to the teenager, his eyes glittering with rage. "Say that again," he growled, taking a step forward. "Do you want to end up like him?" He nodded at the boy still lying on the ground. The teen looked away, but didn't answer. The policeman hummed victoriously and returned to his seat. He glanced at the boy's father, who continued to stand motionless, as if waiting for the moment to make his move. "Is this your great protector?" he said with a grin, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He doesn't even move. People like him only know how to shout about injustice, but when the time comes to act, they remain silent. None of you will do anything." The crowd began to whisper again. Some nodded in agreement with the policeman. Some looked at him with hatred. But no one moved. It was a heavy, agonizing silence filled with fear, shame, and judgment. People watched the boy, his wound, his humiliation, and yet they remained spectators in this spectacle. But something was beginning to change. The crowd was no longer just passive. Judgmental looks became more and more open, and even the most silent ones began to quietly discuss what was happening. The cameras went up again. Someone even turned on the live feed. The atmosphere was heating up with every second, as if someone was about to make the first step to break this circle of silence and fear. And then the voice of the boy's father, calm and firm, cut through the air. "Your power ends here." The crowd, buzzing with whispers and tense anticipation, suddenly parted as if cut by an invisible knife. A tall man in an austere suit stepped from the depths. His face was serene, but an icy fire burned in his eyes. Even his gait radiated confidence, causing everyone around him to freeze. The policeman, noticing him, did not pay attention at first. He was too busy demonstrating his authority to the crowd. But as the man came closer and stood beside the boy, his figure seemed to fill the entire space. The crowd quieted down. Even the wind seemed to subside, waiting to see what would happen next. The boy's father bent down, gently lifting him from the ground. His arms, strong and sure, held his son as if he were the most precious thing in his life. The boy, still trembling, looked up at his father with desperate hope. His father ran his hand over his head, reassuring him. "It's okay, son. I'm here. No one can touch you now." The policeman crossed his arms over his chest, smirking. "Who the hell are you? Another justice fighter? Look, we have our own rules here, and people like you don't tell me what to do." The man straightened up, looking at the policeman. His gaze was cold and hard as steel, but he didn't answer immediately. He let the pause hang in the air, heightening the tension. Then he said quietly but clearly, "That's my son." The policeman snorted, noticing the man's expensive suit, his well-groomed appearance. It made him laugh. "Your son? Well, then I can see why he's so, spoiled. He's probably used to getting everything for nothing. First benefits, then a wheelchair, then you're gonna cry discrimination." The cop stepped closer, eyes glaring menacingly. "You're all the same. First you complain, then you demand respect. But in reality, you're nothing." The crowd buzzed again, but the boy's father did not avert his gaze. His calmness seemed frightening. He adjusted his tie as if the rude outburst did not concern him and said, "You've made a terrible mistake." "A mistake?" The policeman laughed, but you could hear the tension in his voice. "Really? Do you know how many times I've heard that? You think your status, your money, your fight for equality is going to impress me? You're nothing here, and neither is he." He nodded at the boy, "And I'm not going to let you make a circus of it." The boy's father stepped forward, his face remaining impenetrable. "You have no idea who you're messing with," he said quietly, but each word sounded like a hammer blow. "You don't know what it means to take responsibility for your actions, but you will." The policeman tried to smirk, but the expression of confidence on his face began to waver. He took a step back, but kept talking, his words increasingly filled with anger. "You think playing the victim will work on me? You're all the same, always wanting more than you deserve. You think the law is on your side, but as long as I'm here, I decide who's right and who's wrong." "The law?" The boy's father bowed his head as if surprised. His voice became sharper. "You dared to humiliate a child in front of everyone, relying only on your hatred and power. That's not the law. It's your weakness covered by a badge." The crowd started whispering louder. People were already pulling out their phones, filming everything that was going on. Some began to shout condemning remarks, but the boy's father remained focused only on the policeman. His gaze seemed to pierce the man, making him freeze. "Do you think you're a force?" he continued without raising his voice, but his words made the policeman take another step back. "You're just an instrument of hate that will soon be broken. And believe me, I will personally see to it that it is broken." The policeman finally lost his patience. "That's enough," he shouted, grabbing his baton from his belt. "You will not threaten me here. Get out, or I'll have you both arrested." But the boy's father only smiled calmly, and there wasn't an ounce of fear in that smile. "Try it," he said quietly, taking another step forward. And that was the boiling point. The crowd, previously silent and watching from the sidelines, began to move. People stepped closer, the cameras grew larger, and the condemning voices grew louder. The policeman looked around, suddenly realizing that control of the situation was beginning to slip from his hands. The policeman stood, clutching his baton tightly, but not as confidently as before. His gaze darted from the boy's father to the crowd, which was getting closer and closer. People began to whisper judgmentally, and some even shouted phrases. "This is too much. He's abusing a child. Who is this man?" Meanwhile, the boy's father remained calm. He let go of his son, sitting him on the curb, and raised his head, looking directly into the policeman's eyes. He had an expression on his face that was both threatening and completely convinced that he was right. "Do you know who you're messing with?" he asked, quietly and coldly. His voice sounded as if he were speaking not only to the policeman, but to the very system he represented. "Or are you used to thinking that your uniform makes you invulnerable?" The policeman grinned, but it was a nervous, strained grin. "I don't care who you are," he said through gritted teeth. "I'm an officer of the law, and you and your son are out of order. If you want to dance with the law, go ahead." The boy's father tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into an icy smile. "A representative of the law?" he repeated. "You call that a law? Humiliation of a child, rudeness, abuse of power. I've seen your kind hundreds of times. You know how it always ends? Exposed, a trial, and a long process of rethinking your role in society." The crowd around him began to whisper even louder. Someone recognized him. "It's James Carter," exclaimed the man in the gray shirt, craning his neck to get a better look. "Lawyer Carter. He won cases against the police last year." The policeman blinked, his face tense. The name James Carter spread quickly through the crowd like a spark through dry grass. Everyone in the crowd who had been aware of the high-profile rights abuses was now looking at things very differently. People started pulling out their phones even more actively, recording every second. "Carter," the cop hissed, not so sure anymore. "It doesn't mean anything. You're just another disgruntled father here. Your status doesn't change anything." "Not true," Carter replied calmly. "My status changes everything, because I'm not going to let you get away with what you just did." He stepped closer to the policeman, his voice sounding loud and confident, but still holding his restraint. "You know what's interesting? Your rights didn't save the people I was defending. The people you, and people like you, have humiliated, beaten, destroyed their lives just because you could. I've seen it over and over again. But you know what else? Every time I take a case, the truth comes out, and it always ends badly for people like you." The policeman clenched his fists, but his look betrayed fear. He tried to maintain a semblance of control, but Carter continued. "Your name will get out. Your actions will make headlines. And then there will be investigations, lawsuits, termination. That's just the beginning, all because of your own hatred and stupidity." The crowd perked up. Someone started clapping. A young girl in the front rows shouted, "We saw the whole thing. We know what he was doing." "It's not true," the policeman shouted, his voice trembling. "You think you can intimidate me? I have the authority. You have nothing but, except your big words." Carter smiled slowly. "Authority?" he repeated. "They're working against you now, because every second of your behavior here is documented. Your career ended the moment you decided to humiliate my son." The policeman fell silent. For the first time all day, he looked as if he didn't know what to do. The phone cameras were pointed at him, surrounding him like spotlights. Now it was not only a scene of injustice, but also a moment of exposure. Carter turned to the crowd, his voice loud and clear. "I am James Carter. I have defended the rights of those who have been oppressed. Today, I'm defending my son. But I promise you, this case will not end here. It will be the beginning of the end for those who believe that uniforms give them the right to hate." The crowd burst into applause. The policeman took a step back, looking as if he wanted to disappear. But that was impossible now. James Carter was standing right in front of him, ready to take the next step in his fight for justice. The crowd froze, as if the air had suddenly become heavy and viscous. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. The policeman straightened up, trying to reassert his authority. His face was twisted with a mixture of anger and fear, but he tried to hide it behind brutal aggression. "Do you think I'm afraid of you?" he spat out, looking James Carter straight in the eye. "You think your big words and status mean anything? This isn't a court of law, and you're not a lawyer here, just an arrogant dad who thinks he can lecture me." Carter did not flinch. His face remained calm, but there was an icy fire in his eyes that made even those in the crowd uncomfortable. He stepped forward, looming over the policeman, his voice low and sure, like a distant thunderclap. "I don't need big words to prove you broke the law. You did it yourself, in front of dozens of witnesses, in front of my son." The policeman clenched his teeth, his hands nervously clenched into fists. "You have no proof," he shouted. "These people—" He waved his hand at the crowd. "They saw nothing. No one will go against me. I serve the law, and no one will dare question that." Carter tilted his head as if with regret, but there was a hardness in his voice that could not be ignored. "Law?" he repeated, saying the word with such cold irony that the crowd stirred. "You call what you just did a law? The humiliation of a child, the rudeness, the mockery. Is that your idea of order? Or is it just your hatred disguised as power?" The policeman stepped closer, his eyes glittering with anger. Now he wasn't just trying to maintain control, he was looking for a way to intimidate Carter. "Listen," he hissed, "I don't care who you think you are. If you think you can threaten me and get away with it, you're wrong. I can arrest you right now for obstructing my duties." Carter didn't move. On the contrary, he stepped forward again, minimizing the distance between them. His voice remained calm, but it sounded like every word was carved in stone. "Try it. I have people behind me, witnesses, cameras, and most importantly, the truth." "And what do you have?" "Just a badge that you've turned into a tool of hate. I'm warning you, if you make one more false move, I won't just get you fired. I will destroy everything you think you have power over." The policeman backed away, but his face continued to express anger. "You talk too much," he muttered. "You have nothing. Judges aren't interested in cases like this. It's all just noise." Carter grinned, and that grin was intimidating. He turned to the crowd, raising his hand to get their attention. People froze, their phones still recording every word. "This man thinks he's above the law," Carter said loudly. "He thinks his uniform protects him from accountability. But the truth is, he's the violator. He abuses his power through humiliation and intimidation. His behavior is an embarrassment to the system he is supposed to protect." The crowd began to murmur. Cries were heard. "Yes, it's true. We've seen it all. This is too much." The policeman looked around nervously, as if searching for a way out of the situation. He raised his baton, but this only increased the tension. Someone in the crowd shouted, "You want to hit him in front of everyone? Try it." Carter turned to the policeman again. His voice became icy. "It's your choice. One more move and you won't just lose your uniform. You'll lose everything. But if you're smart, you'll stop here and now." The policeman froze for a moment. His face turned pale, but he did not move. He was cornered, and it was obvious to everyone. The crowd continued to huddle around him, and the cameras captured every second. "It will cost you dearly," he hissed, but his voice no longer sounded confident. Carter crossed his arms over his chest. "No," he replied, "it would cost you a lot of money." The crowd around the Carters was growing, buzzing like a beehive. The policeman, feeling the ground slipping from under his feet, still stood there, clutching his baton. His face had turned ash gray, but he kept holding on, as if he hoped everything would just be forgotten. James Carter knew, however, that this story would not end so easily. He was a man who knew how to use every opportunity to achieve justice. "None of us will forget what happened here," Carter said loudly to the crowd. His voice was firm, and his eyes burned with determination. "But I won't stop there. I will make this case known to everyone. Everyone must know that this is unacceptable." He pulled a cell phone from his pocket. His movements were quick, but not frantic. In a few seconds, he was calling someone, taking a couple of steps away from the policeman, who was looking at him with growing concern. "This is James Carter," he said into the phone, his voice filled with confidence. "I have an important case. Tell the editor I'm downtown right now, and there's a blatant case of police brutality going on. Send people immediately." The policeman froze, his gaze sliding nervously through the crowd, which began to whisper even louder. Some of the eyewitnesses were also typing something on their phones, sending videos and photos to social media. Carter, on the other hand, ended the call and switched to his social media. He opened his camera and started recording. "To all who see me," he said into the lens, "right now I'm in the center of the city where my son, a child with a disability, was the victim of humiliation and violence by a police officer. This video is proof that he is abusing his power and breaking the law. We must not remain silent. Share this video so that everyone will know the truth." He finished the recording and instantly posted it online, accompanying the post with powerful words. "When power becomes a tool of hate, society must unite to stop it. This is my son. This is his life, and I'm not going to let it go unnoticed." The post instantly started gaining popularity. Hundreds of outraged messages appeared in the comments. "This is an outrage. Where is the justice? This policeman should be fired. We have to stop this." Meanwhile, journalists began to arrive at the scene. A local news crew was the first to arrive. A female reporter holding a microphone ran up to Carter. The camera captured his focused face. "Minus Mr. Carter, what's going on here?" she asked. "What you see is happening," he said firmly, pointing at the policeman who had begun to move away, trying to blend in with the crowd. "This man, who swears to uphold the law, humiliated and assaulted my son just because he thinks he is above the law. But he is not. I will make sure he is held accountable for his actions." The reporter nodded and, turning to the crowd, asked witnesses to comment on what had happened. Several people immediately started shouting their versions. "We saw everything." He pushed the boy and took away his chair. He laughed at him. It was horrible. Who gave him the right to treat a child like that? Every word was recorded, every face was captured. The policeman, realizing that his surroundings were turning into a battlefield against him, started to back away, but Carter noticed it. "Are you leaving?" he asked loudly. "Have you decided to run away? Is this all you have left?" The policeman turned around, trying to save face. "I'm not running away." He wheezed, but his voice trembled. "I'm doing my job. You want to put on a show, but it won't work." Carter stepped closer, his gaze even more penetrating. "The play?" he repeated. "No, this is not a play. This is the beginning of your responsibility. You used to think that uniforms protected you, but today you will realize that they will not save you. You've been expected, Mr. Lawman. You're now the face of a system that will no longer tolerate you." Meanwhile, social media was bursting with anger. Carter's video spread with incredible speed. News outlets began publishing breaking headlines. "Racist incident downtown. Attorney James Carter steps in to fight for his son's rights." "Police under fire for criticism after video humiliating disabled child." The crowd continued to grow. Journalists asked more and more questions, and the police began to arrive at the scene, clearly agitated by the scandal. The protagonist of this chaos, a humiliated and now frightened policeman, stood motionless, as if hoping that the storm would pass him by. But James Carter knew. This was just the beginning. The morning after the incident, the internet literally exploded. The video, shot by James Carter and eyewitnesses, has already gone viral across all platforms, racking up millions of views. Comments were buzzing with anger. How can this even happen in this day and age? This policeman is the face of everything that is wrong with law and order. We demand justice for the boy and his family. The main page of the news portal carried the headline, "Policeman abuses his power by attacking a disabled child." What will the police say? The article analyzed the incident in detail, supported by quotes from the video and comments from eyewitnesses. The name of the policeman, Sergeant Richard Hayes, became public, and from that moment on his life began to fall apart. Someone on the internet decided to dig into Hayes's past. Soon, other stories related to his cruelty began to surface. Posts started appearing on various forums and social media platforms. I was working in a bar when he attacked my friend, just because he was talking too loud. My brother spent a night in jail for no reason after this Hayes guy pulled him over on the road, all because he wasn't white. This man beat up my neighbor a few years ago. It was hushed up then because he was a good cop. Users began collecting evidence, old records, photos, even copies of complaints filed against Hayes during his years of service. It turned out that many of those cases had been hushed up, and the charges against him had miraculously disappeared thanks to connections in the department. But now that the scandal had gone national, it was impossible to keep quiet. It wasn't just the internet that was gripped by anger. Rallies began to appear on the streets of the city. People with placards lined up in front of the police building. Justice for all. Racism has no right to power. Richard Hayes must answer for his crimes. Local TV channels broadcast footage from the rallies. People demanded not only Hayes's dismissal, but also a full audit of his affairs. The police department was under tremendous pressure. The police chief, appearing at the press conference, looked tired and tense. "We've launched an internal investigation," he said, avoiding eye contact with reporters. "If Sergeant Hayes did break the law, he will be held accountable." But this statement only made people angry. Internet users launched a new hashtag, #SystemRoof. Of course they're investigating, like they didn't know about it before. Everyone knew he was like this, but they were just covering for him. It's time they were held accountable too. How many of these Hayes are there all over the country? As the investigation gained momentum, Hayes lost everything. His name became a symbol of hatred and abuse of power. Friends and colleagues who once supported him turned away. Neighbors began to shun him, and some even posted signs outside their homes saying, "Hate has no place in our neighborhood." One of the reporters got to Hayes's ex-wife, who agreed to be interviewed. Her story only added fuel to the fire. Richard was always like this. Brutal, rude. He thought the uniform gave him the right to do whatever he wanted. That doesn't surprise me. The only thing that surprises me is that he was allowed to do it for so long. The police department, trying to save its reputation, quickly suspended Hayes from the force, but that didn't stop an avalanche of revelations. Every day, new details emerged. His reputation was destroyed. A week after the incident, the county prosecutor announced that criminal charges would be filed against Hayes. He was charged with abuse of power, assault, and a number of episodes involving abuse of authority in recent years. This is not just an isolated case, the prosecutor said at a press conference. This is a systematic violation of the law, and we will seek the maximum punishment. This was a disaster for the police. They tried to distance themselves from Hayes, claiming he had acted at his own discretion. But the public didn't believe it. People demanded reform and accountability for those who covered up his actions. Hayes was alone. His house became the target of attacks. Insults were written on the walls and windows were stoned several times. The news showed him walking out of his house with a flushed face, trying to cover his face with a hood, but he could not escape the judgmental stares. He destroyed his relationship with those around him, one commentator wrote. Now he himself felt the hatred he had directed at others for years. James Carter watched it all with a sense of accomplishment. But he knew this was only the beginning. Hayes was just one of many such people in the system, and now that the truth had come out, he was ready to fight on, for his son, for justice, and for those the system had betrayed. Several months have passed since the day Sergeant Richard Hayes humiliated a child in front of a crowd. The incident was the beginning of an entire movement that sparked a wave of change. But for Hayes himself, those months had shattered everything he'd ever known. The events that unfolded around him became a true karmic denouement. After his suspension, Hayes found himself at the epicenter of public condemnation. Video of the incident continued to circulate, becoming a symbol of injustice and abuse of power. His name became synonymous with hate. He could no longer walk down the street without encountering judgmental stares. People recognized him everywhere. Some shouted insults. Others simply filmed him on their phones as a reminder of his shame. His former colleagues tried to stay away, realizing that his name had become toxic to the police department. When the official investigation began, many of them provided evidence against Hayes in an attempt to save their own careers. That was the final blow. Hayes realized he was all alone. Soon, the first lawsuit was filed against Hayes by James Carter. Carter claimed moral damages for the humiliation inflicted on his son, as well as for physical and psychological injuries. The suit was carefully drafted, with each claim supported by evidence. But it didn't stop there. Other lawsuits poured in, from people who had been hurt by his actions during his years of service. Their complaints, previously ignored or silenced, were now given new life. The DA's office announced a full investigation of all cases involving Hayes. Each episode became a brick in the wall of accusations that grew around him. "For too long he has gone unpunished," Carter said in an interview. "But now he will have to answer not only for himself, but for the system that allowed him to do this evil." Hayes was officially fired from the police department, stripped of his pension and all the benefits that came with his position. His name was permanently blacklisted from law enforcement, which meant he could never work as a police officer again. This debacle did not stop with his professional life. His reputation was destroyed completely. The media continued to cover the case. Documentaries and podcasts exposed the details of his behavior, as well as the systemic flaws that allowed people like him to go unpunished. His story became a lesson for the entire country. But James Carter wasn't going to stop at just punishing Hayes. He used the case as a platform for larger changes. Together with a group of advocates, activists, and victims of police brutality, he initiated a movement for police reform. His goal was clear: to create a system in which abuses of power could not exist. Carter secured meetings with high-ranking officials, including the head of the police department and government representatives. He spoke before Congress about how his son had been victimized by hatred and abuse. His words touched hearts, and his energy inspired change. "We will not stop until people like Hayes are the exception, not the norm," he said. "We need a system that protects citizens, not humiliates them." His efforts led to real change. New rules were introduced requiring mandatory investigation of every case of complaints against police officers. Training programs were also introduced to eliminate bias and racism in the police force. Some states have established independent commissions to oversee law enforcement. A public apology from police came months after the incident. The head of the department, speaking to the press, acknowledged the mistakes and said, "We have failed the community for far too long. We owe an apology to James Carter, his son, and all those who've been harmed by our actions or inactions. Carter accepted the apology, but did so with firmness. Words are a start, but a real apology is action, and I'm here to make sure those actions are carried out. James's son was gradually coming around. Through therapy and his father's support, he began to regain his faith in people. His story became a symbol of strength and resilience. At school, he was now seen as a hero, not a victim. For James Carter, this case became not only a personal struggle, but a mission. He used his energy and resources to continue to fight for those who could not stand up for themselves. His name became associated not only with high-profile trials, but with real change. As for Richard Hayes, his life had become chaotic. He lost his job, his home, and his respect. The lawsuits continued, and his debt for victim compensation grew with each passing month. In an attempt to escape conviction, he left town. But even there, he continued to be recognized. His face became a symbol of retribution for his abuse, and he realized there was no escaping the consequences. The case of James Carter and his son was not just a story of justice, but a signal to society. People realized that even one small victory can be the beginning of big changes. And for those who thought that power gave them the right to abuse, this case became a lesson. Karma always catches up with those who deserve it. Friends, this story is a reason to think about how important justice and respect are in our society. We want to know what you think about this situation. Write your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced racism or injustice? How have you dealt with these moments? Your stories are incredibly important to us because together we can bring more attention to these issues. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to keep up to date with new stories, and give us a like if this topic is close to your heart. Your feedback and support motivate us to keep telling you about what really matters. Thank you for being with us. We wish you a wonderful day full of kindness and warmth.